Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. With TPP being such a topic in the presidential election, that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the Bill of Rights for Corporations, as we've been calling it at the Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, we thought we'd return to the issue of trade and these international trade treaties, but not about TPP. We've already done some programs on that, and we actually have some good updates about our local congressional delegation. But related to these trade agreements there's an entire almost court system, a legal system, that is almost invisible to the rest of us. And it's a major part of these trade agreements. And all the ones that have already been signed and are in force include this legal system, this behind-the-scenes legal system. That's what we're going to learn about tonight, and more importantly, a way that grassroots organizations are trying to respond. And I'm really glad to have two experts with me to help us understand this. First, at the far end of the table, Jesse Swanheiser is the director and founder, I guess, and staff attorney for Voice for the People. Welcome to Other Voices.
Thanks. Happy to be here, Paul.
And right next to Jesse is Sarah Burt, who is a staff attorney for Earth Justice. And thank you for joining us.
Hi.
So I want to give you the opportunity to let people know what your organizations do before we get into the nitty-gritty of these trade agreements. So Jesse, why don't you give us a minute or two?
Voice for the People is a project hosted by the Center for International Environmental Law, or CL. And CL, like Earth Justice, is one of the few organizations that has dedicated substantial resources over the years to making sure that the public interest and the people's voice are heard in these international court systems that we're going to be talking about today. So my project specifically is focused almost exclusively on the case of Trans-Canada versus the United States, which we'll talk about at length, I imagine. And we're fulfilling two roles in that regard. We're helping coordinate a variety of the public interest and civil society organizations that are interested in this case and how it relates to the broader public interest. And then I'm also doing a variety of activities like this, traveling around the country, talking with audiences, educating communities about what these rules mean really for local power and local organizing.
Great, and we'll return to your role and what you're doing in these various cases. Sarah, Earth Justice, I think most people probably heard of it, but give us the rundown.
So Earth Justice is a team of the nation's finest legal minds using the power of law to fight for clean air and water, pristine wilderness, and the health of our communities. And Earth Justice has an international program that was founded 20 years ago now, and its founding was specifically to examine two key areas of international law that have a great impact on the environment. One is international trade law, and the other was human rights. And so the international program really works at the intersection of those three areas: environmental protection, human rights, and international trade.
Yeah, and you've been with Earth Justice for 10 years, you
10
told
years
me
now,
before.
yeah.
So it must be satisfying work.
It's very satisfying
Or they pay really
work.
well or something.
Well, I can't really say the latter, but it is, it's a nice place to go to work every morning.
And you're an attorney yourself, right,
Indeed.
Jesse?
Yeah.
Okay. To try to give you an overview of this, Jesse actually found a really good video with everybody's favorite Elizabeth Warren. So we're going to roll a little video here for a few minutes to get our feet wet on this topic. So if you're here in the studio audience, take a look at the monitor and let's roll it. They're not ready to roll it. This is called filling time. The video was produced by
America
Credo.
shouldn't be signing lousy trade deals, period. Which is why I wanted to thank Credo members for keeping up the pressure to stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP. So what is this fight all about? Supporters of the TPP want you to believe this deal is about America's role in setting the rules of international trade. But here's the problem. TPP isn't about helping American workers set the rules. It's about letting giant corporations rig the rules on everything from patent protection to food safety standards, all to benefit themselves. Now, the first clue about who benefits from TPP is who actually wrote it. During the top secret drafting process, 28 trade advisory committees were formed to whisper in the ear of our trade negotiators. Who sat on those committees? 85% were senior corporate executives or industry lobbyists. And many of the committees, including those on chemicals and pharmaceuticals, aerospace equipment, textiles and clothing, and financial services, were 100% industry representatives. In more than half of all the advisory committees, no one, not one single person, was in the room who represented American workers or American consumers. You know, a rigged process produces a rigged outcome. Take a look at the Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. I know, sounds wonky, but this is the part that gives a huge boost to big multinational companies when they want to challenge a country's laws that they just don't like. Usually, they would have to go to a court, but with TPP, they can skip the courts and use industry-friendly arbitration panels staffed with corporate lawyers. And here's the deal, whatever those panels say goes, no appeals anywhere. These fines can cost a country billions of dollars. And some countries will just back down and change their regulations instead of fighting back. Workers, environmentalists, human rights advocates, they don't get to use ISDS. It's only the big corporations that do. Now that is a rigged system. This isn't just speculation. This is real. Last year, a mining company won an ISDS case when Canada said the company couldn't blast off the coast of Nova Scotia. And now, today, taxpayers in Canada are on the hook for up to $300 million, all because their government tried to protect its environment and the livelihood of its local fishermen. ISDS is also a problem right here at home. Thanks to the hard work of progressive organizations like Credo, President Obama said no to the Keystone XL pipeline last year. Great work. It was a long fight, it was a hard fight, but the Obama administration, applying American law, decided that the pipeline was a threat to our air, to our water, and to our climate. So what's happened? Well, now the Canadian corporation that wants to build this pipeline is using the ISDS provision in NAFTA to demand more than $15 billion in damages from the U.S. For what? For turning down the Keystone pipeline. Look, everyone understands the risks of ISDS, even the people who wrote TPP. In fact, people got so worried about tobacco companies using ISDS that the TPP negotiators decided to say that tobacco companies can't use ISDS to roll back anti-smoking regulations. And look, I am really glad they did that. But it's pretty much an admission that ISDS can be used to weaken other public health laws. Think about it. What about food safety laws or drug safety laws or worker safety laws or environmental safety laws or any other regulations that are designed to protect our citizens? It will be open season on laws that make people safer but that cut into corporate profits. So here's the bottom line. Congress will have to vote straight up or down on TPP. No amendments, no chance to strip out things like ISDS. And that's why I'm counting on Credo members like you to help me fight to stop the TPP over the next few months. We're going to need your voices now more than ever.
And I want to thank Credo and Senator Elizabeth Warren for that really good overview, and thank you, Jesse, for finding that. And like I said at the outset, we're not going to talk about TPP because we've done programs on that, and the point of this was the ISDS, and that's what we're going to talk about. But since Senator Warren did mention TPP so much, let me take just 30 seconds to give you a quick update. The Peace and Justice Center has been involved in a large coalition of labor, and environmental, and trade, fair trade groups working the past year and a half to oppose TPP. And with our local congressional delegation, Jackie Spear, north of here, long ago announced her opposition to it. Anna Eshoo, who has been a pretty avid free trade supporter throughout her 20-plus years in Congress. We had thanks to all you folks who signed petitions, wrote letters, responded to all our action alerts on TPP. We met with Anna back in May, and to our delight and surprise, she announced that she's going to be a no vote on TPP. Zoe Lofgren we met with in June, and she was undecided at that point, but I got to tell you from the questions that she was familiar with all the negatives of TPP. I think she's going to be okay as well, unless anybody has any update on that. All right, ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement, ISDS, and you've brought us, you gave me a list of some really interesting things, and maybe we'll just run through some of these cases and see what's going on out there behind the scenes, because again, these are in all the trade agreements that have been signed so far, right? Starting with NAFTA. And
virtually all the agreements have these. Interestingly enough, the state legislatures or the state legislators in Australia had somewhat of an uprising during the negotiation of the U.S.-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which was originally based exactly on NAFTA and included these provisions, and along with a host of other international actors, was successful in stripping the U.S.-Australia Free Trade Agreement of the ISDS provisions, specifically because they saw many of these things coming down the pike. And then the history is a bit more convoluted than that, but certainly there was a shift during the 70s and 80s, and NAFTA introduced ISDS at a new level. There had been similar rules in the past, but they had required that the state actually enforce them. So in the Trans-Canada versus U.S. case, it might have been possible to bring a challenge to our rejection of the Keystone XL pipeline, but it would have been the onus would have been on the Canadian government to raise that through diplomatic channels. And it was really NAFTA and similar agreements at that time that sort of created this idea of corporate nationhood, the idea that corporations can sue governments on equal footing rather than having to go through the normal diplomatic channels that are traditionally the channels of international law.
let me make sure I've got that right. So pre-NAFTA, Canada, if there was a dispute between a Canadian and a U.S. corporation and a U.S. law or something, the Canadian government would have to make the decision for that to go ahead. Now the corporation just does it on its own. Is that?
That's essentially right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the impetus for these, I think, is interesting, if you don't mind going back a wee bit,
Yeah.
which is that after World War II, there was obviously decolonization, strong East-West tensions, and so as newly independent states and socialist, communist countries decided to exert greater control over their territories and the natural resources, they found themselves at odds with many of the transnational corporations that owned those resources. And so you can imagine Mexico nationalizing an oil field or something of this nature. And that was the sort of impetus for creating the system as it existed after World War II, whereby these companies would get compensated for a physical taking of their property. So something like we have in domestic law, takings law, where that if the city takes part of your property for a road or a park, they're going to compensate you for that. And that was essentially the system up until
broad public good when the government.
Correct. So
Public domain.
So it was the switch in the 80s and 90s with NAFTA that really took this to a new level. And opened up the possibility of suing over things that weren't takings of just direct of property, and then also the advent of allowing corporations to sue directly.
Another element of it, and the reason that many states are willing to sign these, is that there has been an effort to attract foreign investment on the part of developing countries. So from their perspective, if they can give reassurances to foreign investors, they feel that they can hopefully reap some of the benefits of globalization. But the investor-state dispute settlement processes have really taken on a life of their own and have gone in a direction that I think nobody really anticipated at the time, and it certainly backfired for many of those small developing states when they find themselves on the wrong end of some of these challenges.
Yeah, international agreements backfiring on small states. It's not a news story, is it? Let's talk about some of these specific cases and see how this is playing out in the real world. You've broken these down by some issue areas, starting with public health. Where have these kinds of cases impacted public health?
Yeah, the two cases I thought made sense to talk about today were obliquely referenced by Senator Warren, which is the tobacco regulation. So both Australia and Uruguay, along with a host of other countries, but for purposes of this discussion, those two countries both passed a series of tobacco regulation measures, including plain packaging for cigarettes, requiring certain health warnings appear on the cigarettes, some limitations on how many brands can be sold so that you can't sell light or tar-free or whatever else, and then increases in taxation. So this is a pretty standard round of regulations, public health regulations, principally motivated by the fact that smoking-related illness is one of the principal expenditures that countries have in their public health systems. And both of them found themselves in an ISDS court facing Philip Morris International. So Philip Morris International was, as Senator Warren had mentioned, was essentially claiming that these measures expropriated their profits, something like seizing the oil fields in Mexico, but rather than actually taking physical property, what Philip Morris was claiming was essentially that they have some property interest that's protected by these free trade agreements or ISDS rules, and therefore they were bringing challenges under ISDS for that. And I don't recall the exact figures, but I know it was in the hundreds of millions of dollars against Australia, and I believe it was about $50 million against Uruguay.
Wow. And they weren't being barred from selling their product, just these restrictions on how they could sell the product.
Yeah, the property interests included their trademark rights, and so they were claiming that it infringed on the benefits of their trademark, their intellectual property rights.
Because they couldn't put their trademark on the package anymore?
They couldn't have the branding on their packaging the way that they did in other markets.
Jeez.
It was a tremendously important move in Latin America. Uruguay was the first of the Latin American countries to go ahead and put restrictions on smoking in public areas, restrictions on advertising, restrictions on having tobacco companies sponsor sporting events. These are the traditional ways that the tobacco companies have found their ways into our living rooms and into children's minds and whatnot. And so it was a hugely important win, especially because their president at the time, President Vasquez, was an oncologist in his previous career and knew very well what the serious public health implications are of smoking.
So, go ahead.
I was going to say, no, Uruguay actually prevailed in this suit that Philip Morris had brought, but the fact that Philip Morris was able to bring these suits against both Uruguay and Australia had a real chilling effect on other countries who were contemplating similar public health protections.
Thank you. That was going to be my next question. Go
I
ahead.
anticipated you.
Yeah.
Including New Zealand, who had passed such a regulation but was put it on hold until they could see how the case against Australia turned out. And there was also a similar proposal working its way through the legislature in Canada that was scuttled. And part of the conversation in the legislature in Canada about whether or not they should pass these types of regulations was fear of being the recipient of another one of these claims. In fact, R.J. Reynolds had made it clear to Canada that they would be the subject of a NAFTA dispute if they did put in place these types of regulations. So just the threat of these suits, which, as Jesse indicated, are put countries on the hook for huge sums in damages, but also cost a tremendous amount to defend against, can really chill this type of public regulation.
So much so that Uruguay was not able to fund its own legal defense and ended up having to receive money from former Mayor Bloomberg in order to put on their legal defense. So we're talking about economic interests that are not equal. We're talking about Philip Morris, which is a transnational company of ridiculous sums of money versus a developing nation. And there were other chilling effects in addition to those that Sarah mentioned. There were 2 African countries that were considering plain packaging rules, and they got threatening letters from Philip Morris saying, we will take you to court, this will cost you millions of dollars, and both of those were removed. And so I think what is interesting about these 2 cases, especially that the countries won, or prevailed, if you will, in both of the cases, is that the principal interest of Philip Morris in these was not winning the individual case. I think that was their secondary interest, but their principal interest is setting precedent and making sure that all of the countries out there know that when considering public health measures like this, you need to factor in the potential of getting sued. And for countries like Uruguay that can't even fund their own defenses, you can imagine what type of chilling effect that has.
Yeah, in doing my homework for this program, read an article that kind of looked at these suits overall, and in fact, there have been hundreds of them, have there not, of various kinds. And roughly, and correct me if I remember the statistics wrong, but it was saying about a third of them the corporation won, and a third of them the country won, and about a third of them were settled before coming to the end. But the author was saying those that don't come to a resolution one way or the other actually benefit the corporation as well because of this strategic interest in foreclosing on legislation in other countries. Is that about right, what the picture is? So
Yes, and then another element of it is that in many of these suits, we actually don't know what the outcome was.
how is that?
Because they are highly secret. The lack of transparency in these proceedings is really shocking. It's sort of quasi-judicial, but it's happening outside of any domestic legal process. It's arbitration, which means that the company and the country each get to choose an arbitrator. And then the third, it's always a panel of 3, is chosen by agreement. But then the proceedings, unless the parties choose to make them public, are generally held in confidence. And so the public often doesn't know exactly what is agreed to and what settlement has been reached.
Even though it's public legislation, passed by elected legislatures.
Yeah, California's been had measures challenged several times, and it's always been a shock to whoever's sitting in the governor's seat at that time that they don't have access to the quasi-judicial process that's going to be deciding on their measures. And I think it goes to the courts where these are heard weren't courts set up to hear public policy matters. These were commercial arbitration courts. The courts were supposed to hear disputes between 2 private parties, hence the secrecy. The idea that 2 corporations negotiating a contract dispute didn't want the whole world to have access to their trade secrets and whatnot. But it was when that judicial system or quasi-judicial system was sort of repurposed for hearing these massive public policy issues well, I don't know if that's where the problem started, but that's certainly one of the concerns with the fact that public policies are being decided before these 3-member tribunals.
Was there kind of a corporation that pioneered this method of attacking legislative regulations using these trade agreements this way, or do we know how we got this current twist on using the ISDS system?
I don't know if there was one company that pioneered it, do you? Many of the early cases were in the extractive industry, so there have been a lot of cases to do with mining. But they've sort of been across the board. There's been a number on waste management, companies who deal in toxic wastes. So the toxics issue has been a theme.
I think as I understand it, the sort of origins of using ISDS in the way that it's currently used as a sword to strike down public interest policies, as opposed to a shield, which it was before NAFTA and this recent creation. Again, a shielding from nefarious takings of oil fields and whatnot to a sword against public interest policies. This was something that hundreds of millions of dollars were spent in far right-wing property rights think tanks, finding ways to create avenues to challenge what they might not be able to challenge through the domestic process.
Yeah.
And again, and if you look closely at takings jurisprudence in the US, there's been a host of efforts to establish this as domestic law. The property rights advocates would love for there to be such a thing as regulatory takings, that when a regulation goes so far as to affect their profits, that they should be able to be compensated for that. And US law does compensate them if it essentially operates to take all of the benefits of their business away, but not this sort of flexible, malleable standard that we're seeing in ISDS. And so I don't know that there was a single corporation that created this, but it most certainly was a deliberate attempt. And in fact, when the first NAFTA cases started coming out, Daniel Price, who was the negotiator for the U.S. On NAFTA, he was interviewed by The Nation magazine, and the question is, a lot of people seem to think these are unintended consequences, and his response is, and I know this by heart, this is a carefully crafted definition. The parties did not stumble onto this.
Wow.
So I think that while there may not be a specific, there may not be a specific entity that's out there, this was nevertheless part of a concerted legal effort. And in fact, Australia was sent packing in the Australia PMI case because the court found, or the tribunal found, that they had abused the process. What they had done is they had restructured their corporate interests such that one of their subsidiaries in Hong Kong could take advantage of an agreement between Hong Kong and Australia, and that ultimately is why they lost. They didn't lose on the merits per se. They lost because the tribunal saw that they were playing fast and loose with the corporate structure in order to take advantage of a treaty that really hadn't been designed for that purpose.
Yeah, and corporate structures these days are international in and of themselves. Let's move on to some of the other cases. On the climate, you've listed a couple of cases here that you thought we should look at: Lone Pine Resources versus Canada and TransCanada versus the U.S., which we just heard from. What's the Lone Pine versus Canada?
The Lone Pine case is an interesting one. So the St. Lawrence River essentially operates as the border between the U.S. and Canada for some number of miles up in the northeast. And it's been the issue of debate between industry and environmentalists for many years, because it was for so long a critical thoroughfare for industry. And the most recent iteration of the debate between industry and environmentalists was that there were a host of concessions given to companies to mine for gas and oil underneath the St. Lawrence River. And at some point, the provincial government in Quebec decided that given that it was hydrologically connected to the water source that is essential to millions of people, a la Flint, Michigan, that perhaps it made sense to not allow fracking in that area. And so that was the impetus for the lawsuit. And the specific dollar figure is escaping me now. But like the other claims, essentially what Lone Pine Resources has actually claimed in their filings is that they had a right to mine. And that their right to mine was upset by the Quebec government's efforts to address the water issue.
Sounds like what they were arguing was that they had the right to poison Quebec's water system.
They at least think they have the right to the profits that they would have made had they poisoned Quebec's water system.
Well put. Was Earth Justice involved in this, or any of the tobacco ones?
No, we've been involved in a number of other cases, particularly some of the early cases. One that was against the United States that involved a California regulation that placed greater regulatory burdens on gold mining in California. So it required better cleanup of mine sites.
Yeah, it's a pretty dirty business, isn't it?
It's a very dirty business, and improved financial assurance, bonding, to make sure that the company would have the resources available at the end of the mining project to be able to clean up the site. And a Canadian gold mining company called Glamis challenged the United States arguing that this California regulation stripped it of its ability to mine profitably in California, and that was essentially expropriation. And so Earthjustice was involved in these early cases, and not only were we involved because the substance is so important, but also to try to chip away at some of the lack of transparency in the process. And our goal with that case was to establish a right of the public, of citizens, to have their voices heard in these tribunals through intervention or amicus submission. And we were successful in establishing the right of the public to submit their arguments in support of the environment or public health regulation. So trying to chip away at the one-sidedness of the system.
And that's the new strategy, or the strategy that we wanted to talk about, is what you're trying to focus your new organization on.
Yeah,
right?
that's Voice for the People's principal goal, is to make sure that the voice of the people in the tribunal hearings around TransCanada versus the U.S., that the voice of the people is heard, that the story of the thousands, if not millions, of communities across the United States and Canada, and really across the world, that stood up and contributed to a decision of the Obama administration to say no to the Keystone XL pipeline, to make sure that those voices and that story are heard and given credence.
So one of you please explain what an amicus brief is, and how successful is it in situations like this, and actually opening up the process a little bit.
Amicus curiae is one of those Latin terms that has been adopted into legal jargon.
I asked you to explain.
And it means friend of the court. Okay. And so the idea is that even though an entity or a person is not one of the disputing parties, that they have a perspective or information or expertise that can help the court resolve the issues. And so the idea is that because these regulations are for a public benefit, the voice of the people should be part of defending their legitimacy in these tribunals.
But is such a thing built into NAFTA and these other trade agreements, or are you trying to shoehorn something new in there, or?
They were not explicit in the procedures. So NAFTA allows the parties to use established arbitration procedures that exist in international law. There's one under the World Trade Organization. There's another set of procedures under the UN, and the parties can select which of these procedural rules they want to have govern their tribunal. These rules didn't explicitly provide the option of amicus participation, but it does give the tribunals a fair amount of discretion to structure the proceedings in the way that they see fit. And so we made arguments for the right of interested public organizations to submit a brief for the tribunal's consideration. And we have been successful in convincing these tribunals to accept them. And so while the procedural decisions of the tribunals don't have any kind of precedential impact on subsequent proceedings, it has kind of set a pattern and an expectation that there should be a role for the public. But it's not guaranteed by any means.
Yeah, but at least it's a foot in the door or something like that.
It's a foot in the door, and it lets the tribunal know that the public is paying attention. And I think with this TransCanada case, where the issue over the Keystone XL pipeline was of such intense public interest, that it's important to let the tribunal know that the world is really watching what they're doing.
Lori,
this is your strategy, right? Particularly on the Keystone pipeline
Indeed,
case.
I think we have two strategies. We have the first strategy, which Lori Wallach likes to call, of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, which she likes to call the Dracula strategy, which is to suggest that if one drags something out into the light, the exposure will fundamentally change what it is. And so in part, that's what we're doing here tonight, is we're dragging these ISDS cases out into the light so that people can see them, with the hope that the tribunalists' knowledge that the world is, in fact, keeping an eye on them will fundamentally change the way they approach it. But secondarily, I think Earthjustice and the Center for International Environmental Law are very much looking to shape international law. I expect that over the course of the next few months, as we get deeper into the substance of preparing our friend of the court brief, that we're going to be looking really closely at what we expect the State Department to argue, where we expect the Environmental Protection Agency to be on this case, and to prepare a brief that can actually shape international law to forestall some of these cases, or to make them more friendly to public interest policies. I would be Pollyannish to think that the tribunal is going to be terribly influenced by what I write. But I think that, again, in combination of the Dracula strategy with strong legal argumentation that explains just what it took to get the president to reject the Keystone XL pipeline, that this will in fact result in a decision that makes future cases less likely.
And this brief that you're working on, you're doing this on behalf of a number of organizations?
Yeah, there's a great coalition. That's really what Voice for the People has provided to the process thus far, is serving as sort of a logistical headquarters for Earthjustice, Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, Center for Biological Diversity, Greenpeace, NRDC, all of the groups that really were the principal campaigners during the domestic Keystone XL process are now finding that their domestic win is being challenged in an ISDS court. And so they're all participating. I certainly don't speak for all of those organizations, but that's what we're doing. We're trying to coordinate and develop a strategy whereby the people's voice is given in the form of a brief.
All right.
Or multiple briefs.
I know you had another case or two here that you gave me to talk about, but time is flying along, so let's get the audience in here. And if Crystal could get the mobile microphone on. So the way this works, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand and wait for Crystal to arrive with a microphone. And then if you could stand up, make it easier on our camera people. This part of the conversation is for you. We'd like to get everybody involved. So do I see any hands yet? Okay. And it's nice and easy in the back row for Crystal. Right behind you there. And if you would stand up. And hold the microphone close.
My name's Jerry Hunt and I'm from San Jose. My question is regarding corporations and the basis of the corporation's existence, which is a charter. And so what basis does the charter allow the corporation, to establish or to make these kinds of claims? So we should be really looking at the charter of the corporation as to whether it has legal standing to make these kinds of claims.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, and I think it's a fundamental challenge in a globalized world. Is there such a thing as an American corporation or a Japanese corporation? Larry Summers, no bastion of liberal faith, it has described the transnational corporation as what he says are stateless elite who have no allegiance to any particular nation in which they may be headquartered. And I think that that's really what we're talking about, and why I think the phrase corporate nationhood is a particularly useful framework for thinking about this. I'm not fundamentally opposed to the idea that transnational corporations have some place where they address their grievances, but the idea that U.S. trade policy or Canadian trade policy has somehow been hijacked in order to further those interests as opposed to the interests of American workers, American consumers, folks in the developing world. I think that's my principal concern with the idea that the corporations are able to do this.
Well, another problem with it is that the nation, the corporation's status in international law is uneven, and they are taking the rights that they are beneficial to them under trade law, but are fighting tooth and nail to be the subject of international law in other areas, such as human rights, where they hide behind the idea that we're just a corporation, we are not a state, we don't have any status under human rights treaties. So they like the rights, but none of the responsibilities.
Yeah, isn't that so true? Any questions? I don't see any more. Okay, there's a hand there.
My name is Robert Litwiller. I'm from Palo Alto. International law was mentioned, and I I have a thought first about international law and then the question. The thought is that international law is often quoted and never seems to be very effective, but it gives an outlet, a ventilator, if you will, for a lot of strong feelings. And in the end, the results that you'd like to invoke international law for stand against it. In the second place, how does international law relate to what we're all thinking about here to try to open up the ISDS process for public input?
Yeah, the question of the efficacy of international law is an interesting one. The fact is that most nations comply with international laws most of the time. And one of the most effective areas of international law is actually trade law. And one of the reasons is that trade law has real teeth, in that if a state violates trade law or a trade agreement, there is the opportunity for the other state to retaliate with trade measures. And that has a real impact. That is
Meaning like increased tariffs or
Yep.
punitive tariffs. or
They
something.
then have the right to have punitive trade measures, which would otherwise be unlawful under the trade law. And so that it has real economic impact. And one of the problems with these investor-state dispute settlement procedures is that they elevate the trade values over other values in international law. And so whereas, government policy making on the environment or public health is weighing a number of public values, the economy being one of them, but also other interests like the environment or health. Whereas these trade tribunals, because they're only operating under trade law, don't take those factors into consideration. So, yeah.
All right. Anything to add to that?
No, I think it is. It's a fundamental challenge in international law is how does one enforce international law, and that's one of the reasons why trade law is so effective, because there's an actual enforcement mechanism, which is dollars and cents. And how to enforce human rights law, for example, is it isn't quite as straightforward. What I can assure you is that in preparing friend of the court briefs, as many of the organizations like Earth Justice and the Center for International Law do, is we really try to elevate those other international laws, and they factor tremendously into what we present to the court to suggest that one must balance the climate policies that have been so painstakingly developed over the course of the last 2 decades into account when deciding whether or not TransCanada has some right that has been violated by the U.S. And so there is an effort certainly to inject, if you will, some of the human rights and environmental laws in the international arena into the trade debate. But as you can imagine, the tribunalists are only moderately receptive to that.
You said you're trying.
Just to follow up.
Stand up again, if you would, and give our cameras a chance to get on you. Go ahead.
Just to follow up, how do the activities that you all are leading and working hard at, how do they even get in the door to an ISDS panel of 3 corporate judges?
Well, they originally were not permitted. In fact, we oftentimes didn't even know that there were cases happening to submit briefs to, but it was through the work of Earth Justice and the Center for International Environmental Law taking the lead on tracking what was going on and really forcing the door open over many, many years. And really, in a broad historical sense, this is a relatively new innovation, the idea that the public has a voice in these spaces. And so there are definitely naysayers who feel like, well, we haven't seen a tribunal quote from an amicus brief, which, for example, the Supreme Court regularly quotes amicus briefs that are submitted by experts. And they thus far take that as evidence that amicus briefs are not useful. I think that you would find that amicus submission process is exactly that. It's a process, and we're really at the beginning stages of that. But with increased transparency, with the internet, that as the tribunals are aware of people watching, I think that we're going to see some changes. Now that's, and Sarah and I were talking before the show about this, that's really, we're talking about shaping the law, tinkering around the edges, if you will. You're not going to get fundamental reform of the ISDS system by submitting amicus briefs. That's where the advocacy and the other pieces are really going to come into play.
You need to do what Australia's legislature did, is get ISDS out of the trade agreement.
Although it's worth noting that ISDS is in the TPP and Australia is signing up for the TPP, so they are, reversing themselves on that particular piece, unfortunately.
When Australia did, on a previous agreement, take that out, did they have anything akin to what we call fast track, or was it the lack of fast track that allowed the legislature to kind of say, we don't like this piece and we don't like this piece?
I think it came out through the negotiation process before it was voted on by the legislature, yeah.
And it was in no small part due to the work of Sarah's organization and others on cases in California, and California legislators going to Australia to talk with their state legislators and say, look at what's happening. We're passing these reasonable common sense measures to address public health and environmental issues, and we're ending up in court for millions or billions of dollars. And so it was a really excellent example of sort of provincial and state government coordination across borders.
Have there been other major ISDS suits brought against things that were specifically passed by national legislatures? Rather than, like, the Keystone Pipeline was an administration decision. The State Department basically said, we're not doing this. But the tobacco ones that you use as an example, I thought those were laws passed by democratically elected legislatures. I'm wondering if there are other examples of that we might touch on briefly.
Yeah, I mean, there are many. One example that we had been talking about earlier is the PAC Rim case in El Salvador, where the government in El Salvador put a moratorium on mining to protect its water resources. El Salvador has a huge problem with water contamination. About 97% of its water is not fit for human consumption. And
I've been to El Salvador, I know.
So you know. And based on that concern and based on the knowledge that mining, in particular gold mining, which can release countless toxins and heavy metals into water, they put a moratorium on gold mining. And PAC Rim, a mining company, brought a claim under, was it CAFTA originally, although
Central America.
The Central American Free Trade Agreement, although that ultimately got dismissed and they pursued it anyway, claiming that their inability to mine at a particular site was a violation of their property rights.
And I think it's worth noting that in the case of TransCanada versus the United States, if we lose, it's a tremendous blow to democracy, but we can afford to pay, if we had to, the $15 billion. And I certainly hope that we don't. But when a country like El Salvador, the size of Massachusetts, with a population density and lack of development there, faces these types of claims, it's not just a chilling effect, it's an existential threat to the ability of those governments to function and represent their people. And so I think that while these ISDS cases are particularly concerning, are very concerning when applied to developed states, it's an especial threat to the developing world.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Is there anything in these ISDS procedures that would allow something other than a monetary reward to the corporation? In other words, in El Salvador with this PAC Rim case, could the tribunal say you've got to let them mine?
Companies have certainly asked for that.
Rather than monetary damage?
Well, in the tobacco case, the tobacco packaging case against Uruguay, the relief they were asking for was either a reversal of that policy, plus the damages that they had suffered while the policy was in effect, or larger compensation for their ongoing lost property interests and lost profits. So yeah, they've asked for both damages and that kind of injunctive relief or order that a country reverse itself on its policy.
And what's Pac Rim looking for against El Salvador?
$300+ million.
So they're not looking for an option.
As far as I know, I think that they were just looking for the damages.
And where is that case now? Is it ongoing or has it?
So the tribunal initially decided that it did not have jurisdiction to hear the claim, but nonetheless said that the case could continue in arbitration under El Salvador's own investment rules. And so that's where the case is right now. And there has not yet been a decision, although I understand that it's expected at any time.
So if it's under El Salvador's own laws, why
isn't it in their courts?
Their courts? Yeah.
It's a good question.
Man. Any other questions out here? Or just express your outrage. There's someone who would like to express an outrage.
I would like to ask a question.
Yeah.
2 questions. My name is Alexei. I'm from Sunnyvale. So my first question is, I understand that corporations are transnational entities, but there are some corporations that are US-based. Do they need to go through the US judicial process when they want to challenge a law, or can they also use this ISDS process to challenge the US law?
The answer is very quick. I'll go ahead and interrupt you briefly, which is ISDS protects foreign entities only. So the Pacific Rim case, for example, even if the law at issue had equally affected a Salvadoran mining corporation, they would not have redress to ISDS. So it's strictly something that protects corporations doing business between borders.
So it's easier for a foreign corporation to sue the United States government than for a US-based corporation.
Yeah, and that's one of the, well, I think ironic is probably the wrong word, but one of the legal bases for challenging a decision of a country is discriminatory practices. In other words, the argument that a country is treating its own companies more favorably than foreign companies. But the reality is that when foreign investors have recourse to this extrajudicial process, they actually have more rights and benefits than the domestic companies, as you're pointing out. So it does put foreign companies at an advantage over the domestic companies.
Excellent insight.
So I have one more question.
Go ahead. Hold the mic up a little closer.
So, I don't have enough knowledge about the trade agreements, but from what I read, for example, in Chomsky's books, he mentions that as any other international law, it works to the advantage of the stronger nations and to the detriment of weaker countries. So basically, he says that if the United States wants to establish a protectionist policies, they would find a way to violate the free trade agreement that they signed. But at the same time, if Mexico wants to establish some protectionist policies, they would be persecuted, and they would be forced to reverse their protectionist policies. So does this, is this actually true, and does it also apply to all these ISDS cases? Because I would imagine that it's much easier to sue El Salvador rather than the United States.
Yeah, I think there's sort of 2 answers to that, which is the real foundation for free trade comes from agreements signed between Western countries, largely developed countries, following World War II. So it assumed a certain level of economic activity and basic regulations, which don't exist in much of the developing world. So I think that there is, at the very least, a sort of structural bias against the developing world in that regard. And then as far as how ISDS specifically operates, as you asked in your first question, ISDS operates to protect foreign investors. Developing countries, in economic terms, are called capital importing states. They don't have capital from inside, so they need to have foreign investment come in order to do the development. So again, you have a basic economic structural issue whereby developing states, because of the fact that they need to import capital, are going to be more likely to suffer just by the numbers, the results of these agreements, and then these rules, and then as the Uruguay case points out, those countries that aren't able to put up a strong defense are obviously are easier targets for the transnationals.
Great, thank you. Excellent questions. I have just a procedural question here. When you submit one of these amicus, or is it amicus briefs?
Depends on who you ask, Paul.
When you submit one of these, do you go to the tribunal and present it, or do you mail it into a P.O. box? Or I'm kind of interested in the process.
Yeah, I mean, it is not the public theater of a domestic lawsuit.
Yeah.
So very little actually happens in person, at least as far as the public is concerned. You submit it by email, you mail it in. There is an individual who is responsible for kind of administering the work of the tribunal, and they provide the email and the P.O. box, and you send it in. There have been arbitrations where they've had witnesses and gone through some more in-person proceedings, but they're not open to the general public. They haven't been.
And is this process helping you find out the results anymore? Earlier in the program, you talked about sometimes you don't even know what the decision has been.
The trend is definitely towards increasing transparency. I think it's not where we'd like it to be, but we're certainly getting more information and data about those cases that are taking place, when they're taking place. But we still have to request, in the Trans-Canada case, for example, we still have to request for access to the materials of the tribunal. There is no guaranteed right that we get to see what Trans-Canada is writing and when they're submitting it. So I think we're in transition, but the trend is definitely towards increasing transparency.
Okay, and very quickly, because we're almost out of time, is there anything substantially different in the ISDS as it appears in TPP from previous ones? About 20 seconds.
One thing I would highlight is the potential for challenges based on financial regulations. So we might see an expansion of the types of suits that are going to be brought.
Involving financial...
Wall Street, yeah.
Yeah, Wall Street.
Also, the sheer number of transnational corporations that participate in that agreement increase the likelihood of future challenges.
Okay, well, thank you for bringing this information to us. Jesse Swanheiser, Director of Voice for the People, and Sarah Burt, Staff Attorney with Earth Justice. I know I've learned a lot. I hope your new strategy expands and expands, and we drag that vampire out into the sunlight a little bit more. You've been watching Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. Thank you, audience, for coming. Next month, our title is Surveillance is a Local Issue. It's not just the NSA that's spying on you. Local police departments are too, and there's a new movement afoot to rein that in. Come back next month and learn about that. Jesse, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sarah, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching.